As we continue with the Dodd report, let's recap for just a minute. The tax-exempt foundations, such as the Carnegie Endowment, the Ford Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation, manipulated behind the scenes and continue to manipulate behind the scenes to push their agenda, which Mr. Alan Gaither so noted that they will use. Why? And I quote, "Our grant-making power so to alter the life in the U.S. that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Close quote. Merged with communism, the U.S. is the last holdout in their socialist communist push all over the earth. Why? To elevate their ruling class power over all. But I digress. Let's look further into the interview of Mr. Dodd. Quote, "And I said, of course, legally, you're entitled to make grants for this purpose. But I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of this country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country just what you told me?" And his answer was, "We would not think of doing any such thing." Close quote. Upon Mr. Dodd's assistant, Catherine Casey, locating information on the Carnegie Endowment, quote, "We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie Foundation began operations. And in that year, the trustees meeting for the first time raised a specific question which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is this: is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they concluded that no more effective means to that end is known to humanity than war. So then in 1909, they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? And finally, they answered that question as follows: we must control the State Department. Close quote. Quote, and then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? They answer it by saying we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally, they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Quote, at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. Close quote. Okay, so it's decided that the agenda will also be pushed through the educational system in America, and the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Endowment are to personally oversee this part of the agenda. How? By altering the teaching of American history with the assistance of the Guggenheim Foundation. Quote, so they approached the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion: that portion of education which could be considered domestic should be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. Close quote. Okay, and this is just in my opinion. All of the bloodline families appear to work together on this agenda, investing their money in projects and their foundations and in their endowments that will eventually take down this country. And aren't we witnessing the product of that line of thinking and teaching today? But I digress. Okay, quoting, quote, they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in the alteration of the teaching of American history. Quote, then they approached the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assemble 20, and they take these 20 potential teachers of American history to London. That group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then, toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what this country looks forward to in the future. The essence being the future of this country belongs to collectivism, administered with characteristic American efficiency, close quote. Mr. Dodd goes on to say, and I quote, but they had to have something in the way of rationalization of their decision to do everything they could to stop completion of this investigation, given the direction that it was moving. That direction would have been exposure of this Carnegie Endowment story and the Ford Foundation and the Guggenheim and the Rockefeller Foundation, all working in harmony toward the control of education in the United States. Close quote. Towards the end of the interview, and I quote, and this is Griffin speaking, how would you describe the motivation of the people who created the foundations, the big foundations in the very beginning? What was their motivation? Dodd answers, quote, their motivation was, well, let's take Mr. Carnegie as an example. His publicly declared and steadfast interest was to counteract the departure of the colonies from Great Britain. He was devoted just to putting the pieces back together again. Griffin, quote, would that have required the collectivism to which they are dedicated? Dodd, quote, no. These policies are the foundation's allegiance to these un-American concepts. These policies are all traceable to the transfer of the funds over into the hands of trustees, Mr. Griffin. Those trustees were not the men who had a hand in the creation of the wealth that led to the endowment or the use of that wealth for what we would call public purposes. Griffin goes on to say, it was a subversion of the original intent then. And Dodd, oh yes, completely so. We got into the worlds traditionally of bankers and lawyers. Griffin goes on to say, how have the purpose and direction of the major foundations changed over the years up to the present? What are their purposes and directions today? Dodd goes on to say, 100% behind meeting the cost of education, such as it is presented through the schools and colleges of this United States, on the subject of our history, to prove that our original ideas are no longer practical. The future belongs to collectivistic concepts. There is just no disagreement on this. Mr. Griffin goes on to say, why do the foundations generously support communist causes in the United States? Mr. Dodd goes on to say, well, because to them, communism represents a means of developing what we call a monopoly, as the organization will say of large-scale industry, into the administrable unit. Griffin says, do they think that they will? And Dodd replies, they will be the beneficiary of it, yes. Close quote. We are stopping here for now, But aren't we beginning to see the so-called picture they are painting here? These foundations are guilty of treason, in my opinion, and this is 1954 we're talking about. Why weren't they held accountable? Stay tuned. We will continue down this rabbit hole.